Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with.
Phil Masters, GURPS writer and author of GURPS Dragons, amongst other things.
Hmm. Yes, you've been involved with Steve Jackson games for some time in the past.
It's actually past 30 years now, which is kind of frightening. But yes, I got involved back in the third edition days in the early 90s, and have proved to be we've proved to be a reasonably good fit. So I've just carried on doing work for them on and off ever since. So. My career in role playing writing goes back a bit further than that. I started out in the early 80s, but the GURPS stuff goes back to 93ish, I think,
Hmm.
which was GURPS Arabian Nights was the first. Uh, and
Hmm.
still working for them on occasion.
And today we're going to talk about GURPS Dragons, which is, even though it was made during the third edition days, it's still in print. So most role-playing games tend to stay away from dragons as player characters. And I can see why, because I guess most games start you out at a very, very low level and you progress up, and then your character either dies or retires and then starts all over again. And usually we don't start playing super powered characters so beginning the game. So I can see why some games, because maybe the system is not made to handle all that. But GURPS Dragons, you could play dragons as player characters, which I find that very exciting. If I know this goes back many years, but do you recall how the origins of this book was made, how it was created?
Well, to be honest, this one started out with a different author. Joe Ramsey did some work on it to begin with, but for some reason that didn't come together. And Steve Jackson Games then threw it my way. But that was a time when when the GURPS line was very much building on themed books. There was GURPS. It was a time when you had things like GURPS Mars, which was just all about Mars in games, the planet Mars in games, and plenty of historical books, and there'd been books about undead and vampires and spirits and so on. And I think dragons just came to somebody as the next theme or type of creature to approach. Given that you'd had these books about spirits and undead and so forth, the idea with dragons was approaching it the same way. Everything you could talk about with dragons that you could think about with dragons in games. As you say, dragons as player characters were certainly an option, but equally you could have dragons as powerful antagonists, which of course they always were, going back to the beginnings of the hobby. But if you're going to have them as something more than just the boss monster at the end of the dungeon, what was their nature? What would you then? How would the GM play them as characters? I suppose, and equally, there was the interest value in there being dragons of one sort or another being cropping up in various mythologies and taking various forms, and the book tackled that both as different types of dragons as player characters, again as you say, or different types of dragons as encounters in a game, which wasn't new. I mean, even going back to the old days of D&D, you had the chromatic dragons as baddies and the metallic dragons as goodies. I'm not sure how often the latter got used, but they were always an option.
So I'm very fascinated with Steve Jackson books, especially the early stuff, because I think nowadays for role-playing games, it's very important that we get historical accuracy, getting the right information about culture, setting, time period, things like that. And while other books kind of made up lore about dragons, this book specifically looks into real lore of dragons, the real history of dragons in different mythologies, Western and Eastern mythology. I know, again, I know it's been some time since you created this book, co-created this book, but is there any elements about the history that stand out to you still to this day?
The thing with dragons is that when you look at them, they're a fairly loose concept. You've got the obviously the big reptile with the wings and the flaming breath and so on, which is what everybody thinks of when you say dragons, and that's mostly what people meant when they said dragons. I suppose any time from the late Middle Ages in Europe onwards. But then the name got attached to other things that had some of those attributes, but not necessarily all of them. I mean, when Westerners encountered Chinese mythology, referred to. I think the Chinese word is lung. They referred to them as dragons because they were big reptilian, powerful, magical creatures, but they're not very like Western dragons. And equally, people looked at various other monsters from other mythologies or creatures, perhaps I should say politely, because some of them were gods or spirits or whatever, and called them dragons. And you could say that there's a sort of common feature. There's clearly something that appeals about the core idea, coming right down to a giant monster that with a flaming breath that destroys communities. That's Godzilla, isn't it? I mean, there's obviously an idea in there that people are always going to be interested in. That sort of has an appeal to people when you start looking at it. But it but because there's such a diversity, you can actually take a look at it, you can actually mix and match and play with different themes. So, which is why, although part of the book is about stats for dragons and templates for dragons, so you can play them as player characters in games if they fit. There's also a section on how you use dragons in play and what is the nature of the what is the sort of significance of the dragon in the game? Is it just another monster, or is it the key the sort of key mythology of the game, the theme of the game in some sense, or is it one of several? Are they powerful? Are they surprisingly weak? What do you do with them?
So I noticed in chapter 2, Playing with Fires, where you talk about using dragons in your games. You talk about as using them as intelligent monsters. What about a dragon's role when it comes to dealing with all different aspects of the lore, like from riddles and so forth? If you were using dragons in your game world, where do you go to? What ideas do you go to for inspiration?
I've never, to be honest, I've personally never run a game where I started with the idea of dragons. I mean, I may have run games where dragons appeared. I have run games where dragons appeared, but in each case, it was you start with. My approach was to start with in each case was starting with the game world and what's the significance of dragons in this setting. But equally, I mean, I think it's an equally valid option to start by saying we want to have dragons in the game. What sort of dragons are they going to be? And I was trying to support that. I mean, I don't happen to have done that in games I've run personally, not well, apart from the occasional demonstration game, and so I'm tied up with the book. But point of you can approach it from either direction. It's you've got the world. I subsequently did GURPS Brainstorm for Steve Jackson, which is a fantasy world in which dragons happen to be a type of creature, which are a particularly powerful background feature of the game world. You don't often get to meet them, but they're impressive and possibly manipulative behind the scenes masterminds when you do. That was, I think, that would be an example of a world which started as this is going to be generic fantasy. We're going to have generic dragons. What are we going to do with them?
Mm.
Which was a valid approach. I didn't create that particular setting, but equally you can, as I said, you could actually, if you wanted to start with the dragons and work forward from there, then that would be an equally valid approach.
If I may ask, even though it's been some time again since this book was published, do you still feel that the information here and the rules here would still be important and interesting to game masters today?
I would hope so. I mean, the stats, as you said, I wrote it as GURPS third edition book, and while it was being developed and edited, GURPS fourth edition was coming together. Coincidence of timing at the time, and I wasn't even familiar with GURPS fourth. I'd seen some of the manuscripts, but I wasn't familiar with GURPS fourth edition when it came out or when it was being written. But somebody else who Devin Granger and Brian Hogue, who'd become familiar with fourth edition quicker sooner than I had, gave it an appendix which converted the stats in its fourth edition. So in that sense, you can certainly still use it for GURPS fourth edition games. But equally, yes, I'd like to think that you can still use it for even for non-GURPS games, because it's got information about different types of dragons in mythology and in fiction, of course, and sort of the discussion of how to use them and what their symbolic significance might be is still, I would say, still valid for any game where you're going to involve dragons, I would hope. I mean, obviously, other people's fantasy worlds have specific functions for dragons, and I wouldn't seek to co-opt that. But I'd hope that people could, in many cases, people could at least get some ideas about how to about how to develop them in other fantasy games and in science fiction games, science fiction and horror games for that matter. They all have dragons can flow over into other games. So obviously, they're rather strongly they're rather strongly associated with fantasy.
In chapter 3, hatching a dragon, we there's a great section about yes, a great section about how dragon templates, how to make dragon characters, but there's also some more information about like undead dragons, again back to Asian dragons and even dinosaurs, which is very interesting. Um, it sounds like with this you can make a you could go as far as make a yeah, like you said, like a Godzilla character. If I may ask a fun question, if I ask you, hey, can you make me a dragon, a GURPS dragon character? You know, it could be a PC or an NPC, it could be a mastermind villain or a hero dragon. What character would you make?
Oh, I'm allowed to assume any kind of setting I wanted to
Yeah.
to work with. Um, there's always an interesting possibility of putting dragons into the modern world. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to fit them in because if there were dragons in the modern world, why don't we see them? It would always be a question. But I'd probably, if you asked me to do that today, the first thing that I could come up with offhand would be to do a sort of weird horror setting, and then say, you know, dragons are figments of people's imaginations, but they're no less real for that. What could you do with a spirit dragon? In fact, one who it occupies a different occupies a sort of parallel plane, but can sort of intrude on the real world. And the easy thing to do would be to make it a horror monster, and obviously a fairly scary one when people finally came face to face to it. But equally, you know, would it be perhaps you could do it as a a, a spirit dragon closer to something like the Chinese type, where it's a force of nature, and you have to and you have to interact with it in that way. If you wanted me to do a dragon as a PC, well, that would very much have to depend on the world. But I'd probably say, what the heck? Just take a standard fantasy world and then have a young hatchling dragon that's trying to actually make its way in the world without getting squashed by bigger dragons or hunted down by heroes who think that killing a dragon is how to make their name.
And I see chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 4, Tooth and Clawed, Fiery Maw. By the way, I love these chapter titles. And
With that, yeah.
and chapter 5, Dragons and Magic. This is a section where you kind of flesh out more of your the characters, whether it be NPCs or PCs. The magic section is very interesting. Was it difficult trying to create like magic for dragons, or did you have to go look for like history and myth to find?
At this time, GURPS Magic, I mean, GURPS Magic, the default GURPS Magic system, of course, is the spell system. And so the tendency was to start with that and fit it around dragons. But equally, you've got an idea in a lot of stories that dragons are magically powerful in some way. So the part of that chapter is looking at what spells a dragon might know, and if you're following the standard GURPS system, how would dragons use it? That to be honest, is a fairly short chapter, and looking back, I'm sure one could do more with the question of dragons and magic. But that was really a chapter about letting dragons use magic if you want to have this idea of dragons as beings who are in some sense inherently spellcasters, which is a thing that comes up in some stories. So it's not not universal by any means. That was a fairly small. That, to be honest, that was a fairly small part of the project. That was just sort of tackling some fitting GURPS spells to dragons, which is feasible, but not a big part of it, to be honest.
Chapter 6, Slayers and Servitors. Again, I really love that this book presents so many different options of what to do with dragons. So, anything about this chapter that stands out to you still?
I mean, I think that's a chapter. Yes, it's a chapter with the character templates. I mean, a lot of it was sort of questions of things like tactics and dragon hunting, and what would people? I mean, there's a traditional idea with dragons that you have the knight in shining armor who exists to hunt monsters because that's what knights in shining armor do, and that's one perfectly valid idea about using dragons in games. They're the big monster that your knight in shining armor gets to fight when he's got powerful enough. But equally, you could have this idea, sort of more cynical modern idea, which comes up in one or two films, of the professional dragon hunter who uses tactics and special weapons and what have you to slay dragons as a job, which is kind of a risky job, but it could be you could have that in games. And equally, you get stories from history, from mythology of dragons that were basically obviously giant constrictor snakes. So you have to have so you have this idea that comes up in one or two stories of people who go out in spiked armor, and the dragon is stupid enough to wrap itself around the guy in spiked armor and squeeze, and tends to come off second best as a result of that. So there's all the sort of thing you deal with. But equally, it's got the templates for the types of dragon slayer, the barbarian, the knight in shining armor, the thief who sneaks in the back of the lair. And I rather enjoyed having the one or two other templates for sort of scholars who are actually brave and stupid enough to go out and study dragons firsthand, or people who've been sacrificed to dragons, but who have survived by wit, or because the dragon wasn't feeling hungry that day, or the servile minion. If you've got a big monster living in a lair somewhere, the odds are you're going to have a few Igor. A lot of the time, in a lot of situations, you're going to have the Igor types who survive by crawling and going fetching sacrifices for it, and going out and negotiating for trading for more gold, which is all part of it. So yes, I was quite fond of that chapter, simply in terms of having humans who interact with dragons as something more than being powerful enough to actually chop dragons' heads off, which is possible, but obviously a bit like hard work if you've got serious dragons. Moderately pleased with that chapter in that sense.
Mm. And I have to say, I do love they're small sections, but the 101 things to do with that dragon,
Oh yeah,
and dragon hide armor. That's pretty much the one thing that player characters always ask after they fight a dragon. Like, hey, can I make body parts into sell it as magic weapons or alchemy, or can I make this into armor? That's like the number one thing, you know.
indeed. Yeah.
But I love that it answers those questions.
Sadly, we didn't get 101. I think that's mostly, that section is mostly credited to Joe's creation. But yes, it's always fun if in a very modernist, in a modern or postmodern sort of way, that people not only want to play heroes who go into dungeons or caves or whatever and fight monsters, but want to know what they do with the bits afterwards. It's a cynical approach. It's very modernist, but yes, it can be. It's amusing. And equally, of course, you've got this idea that yes, you can make your dragon hide into armor, but if you ever meet another dragon, you're going to have some talking to do.
So the next three chapters, they're all smaller chapters, but they all kind of have a theme of dealing with setting and time. The Dragon's Return, The World with Dragons, and Dragons Today. Each one kind of looking at it in a very different aspect. Where the Dragon's Return is what is the human response or the town's response if a dragon comes nearby. The World with Dragons deal with like, okay, if dragons are there already, what do you do? How does the world work? And Dragons Today, if we're having in a modern setting. I love that. Again, I love that GURPS gives you options, so you could do almost anything with dragons. Anything about these chapters stand out to you?
Those chapters, I mean, Steve Jackson Games, when we were talking about doing the book, and they approached me about this one. They said they wanted a setting in there, and to be honest, I think that one was a little bit. It was the end of the Big White Wolf era, and they liked the idea of a modern day setting or campaign framework where you could actually play or work for the monsters. Dragons are a bit harder than vampires in that sense. You know, vampires at least are human sized, but so they specifically asked for that, and I was playing with ideas for that. And one of the things I've been looking at while working up the book was Edwardian children's stories, where you get the occasional story about people encountering dragons who are sort of act like Edwardian gentlemen sort of thing. So I decided, what the heck, let's actually try and provide a logical basis for that. Well, as logical as a story about dragons can be. So yeah, the three chapters there, the first couple are about this Edwardian period setting which is a conspiratorial game, because that's something that there was an association between GURPS and conspiratorial stuff because, at that time, because of GURPS Illuminati and so forth. So the idea there was, well, perhaps the dragons were running the conspiracy in Edwardian England, and I built a sort of set of ideas and a campaign framework about that, where you can play the dragons, but equally you can play people who are either working for them or investigating them. And the dragons are these big, powerful, strange creatures who have returned to the world for reasons obscure, and are now running the conspiracies that run the world. And that's giving you dragons not as just this big flaming monster that crushes towns and you have to fight, but as this this powerful figure in the background of the whole mystery. And after you've tracked the conspiracy back to its lair and worked out what's going on, and you confront it, you suddenly find the thing you're confronting is 50 feet long and has scales and flaming breath, and maybe you need to reconsider your tactics at this point. And then there was because Edwardians all very well, but not everybody wants to play an historical game. Then the Dragons Today chapter was just bringing that forward 100 years to the modern day, and giving you and looking at how that setting would then look with the modern framework. That was very much a sample. That was a fairly specific sample setting, but it was trying to come up with a conspiratorial setting where, instead of being cunning vampires or rustic werewolves, they were dragons. It's a bit of a stretch, but I think it came together as a reasonably entertaining setting idea.
And last but not least, chapter 10, Other Times, Other Dragons, which, when looking at this section, it looks almost like, all right, a culmination of extra ideas that you may want to use for your campaigns.
Well, I mean, as I said, the book had been not just stats for dragons, which you could do, but it'd be a shorter book. Well, I did do it, but it's a shorter part of the book. But having this idea of what do you do with dragons, how do you build a campaign where the first thing you think about is the dragons. The earlier chapters, the three chapters we just talked about, is one answer to that, but obviously there are others, and that chapter is giving you 1, 2, 3, 4 slightly longer and a bunch of other shorter ideas for campaigns. You get the fantasy game where you're playing dragons. You get the Oriental fantasy game where you're dealing with Chinese dragons. You get a game which is really about magic in the modern world, but where the magic is tied up with the symbolism of dragons. And you get, just for complete variety, you get a science fiction game which is about an alien, about an extraterrestrial world being settled by humans, where you find creatures that are, in a certain sense, dragons. It's just another example of using the image. And then a bunch of short ideas for actually two horror games, a mecha game, a science fiction game, and one even I can't remember. Just a second. Typhon is yes, a world where the dragons are running things. So yes, those were really examples of, I've said you can do all sorts of campaigns using dragons. Here's where I prove it. I mean, they're shorter, obviously, and would need a bit of development if you use them. But I think looking at them, they're all settings I could actually go back to, and one of these days might even consider going back to and developing at greater length, just for the fun of it.
And then, of course, the appendix at the end. Well,
they're actually fourth edition conversions, yes, for the game stats from earlier in the book, which, as I said, that was a couple of other people handled that one. So making this a fourth edition book as well as the third edition book, it always shows up in the list of GURPS titles as the only fourth edition book.
Again, this book was published some time ago. Looking back at it, what are your thoughts about the book now? Like, do you look back at it? Do you feel, hopefully it's very fondly?
I'm very fond of it. I mean, another thing I can boast about, because I can take no credit for it, is the art by Alex Fernandez, who was doing some work for Steve Jackson Games at the time. and he did a lovely job on that book. The cover I'm sure you'll be showing off when you do this. And yes, but the whole book is full of these lovely line and paint images of all sorts of dragons, and he obviously read the text, which is not always guaranteed with going to illustrate. And yes, I'm very fond of that. The reason it's still in print is, well, I mean, the main reason it's still in print is simply that Steve Jackson Games preserved the PDF, as selling as a PDF, and can now put it out as a through print on demand technology. So it's lasted. In retrospect, if I was doing it now, if I was revising it now, I would be. The only thing I regret about the book, perhaps, is it was a bit of a prisoner. There was a lot of backward compatibility with previous GURPS books, which had stats for dragons, which were perfectly good, and I'm not knocking any of them. But I was working with backward compatibility with those, and some of them were a bit inconsistent or not quite how I'd have done things. And if you gave me as a dream job revise this book today, I'd probably tweak it, remove some of the backward compatibility for the sake of making a slightly tidier job of some of the stats and so on. But that's a fairly technical issue. And yeah, I mean, I'm very happy with it because it's as you say, it's still available because of the print on demand technology. It's even available in color, which is how it looks best. And I think it's still potentially useful just as a broad overview of dragons and games, as well as having some actual GURPS mechanics in it, which I'd like to think are always useful. These things, any book I've ever written, I've looked back on and thought I could have done that a bit better, but that's just my perfectionist streak emerging. He says modestly, but yeah, I'm happy with it in retrospect, and it's a nice book to have. It's always nice when I've got my old books on the shelf and there's one I can pull down where I think, I got that right, and gosh, that looks nice, which I think that one does, honestly. But,
Yeah, I think well, I'm gonna make a guess, but I think the powers that be at Steve Jackson Games must have really liked this book, just because it's one of the few GURPS books that has its own distinct look. Usually, GURPS cover a GURPS book tends to look the same, style wise, design wise. The cover, the way it's put together, it's usually the same. Not this book. This book, it stands out. That's how I became acquainted with this book, looking through the catalog, and I saw this like, oh wait, a GURPS book about dragons, and why does it look so distinct? And and
I can't speak. You'd have to ask them about the details of the production, but I think they were playing around with the look of the game. I mean, as you say, they've been very consistent on the third edition books for about 10 years up to that standard trade dress, black borders, standard fonts and presentation and so on. I think they were beginning to play with the presentation and sort of try and update it. I think they probably felt it was beginning. I can't speak for them, but I assume they felt it beginning to look a bit dated. So yes, they took that third edition approach and then revised it a bit to use the full color printing and Alex's art and so on, and use some ideas which subsequently emerged in the fourth edition. But yes, I agree. It's a nicely presented. It's a nicely produced and presented book, and it is a nice one, which is why I'm fond of having it on the shelf. Yes.
So, if I may ask, what are you currently working on today?
I'm just wrapping up another. These days, of course, a lot of GURPS books are done as shorter PDFs, and I've done quite a few of those. By complete coincidence, I'm just wrapping up GURPS Fantasy, a shortish PDF called GURPS Fantasy Folk Reptilians, which is about reptile men, serpent men, that sort of thing in fantasy games. Templates for different types of reptile men, which I suppose uses some. I may even have use some of the research I did for Dragons 20 years ago. Thinking about it, there's a little bit of that in there, but that's really just a short one about playing lizard men in games, it has its own interest. I'll look at some other GURPS. After that, it's a bit quiet, but I'm waiting on books for other companies. I did a Trail of Cthulhu book for Pelgrane Press, which hopefully will finally be out this year. It's been waiting a long time for various reasons. I think I've got one or two ideas for that I'm going to have to pitch to companies, but I couldn't actually talk about them now because they'd be a long way off, and they might not like them. So it's been a fairly quiet few months since, well, ever since COVID. I'm sure we've all had slightly weird experiences of getting stuff out,
Mm.
but yes, the current, my last few books for GURPS were all in these fantasy folk ones. So I covered goblins, goblins and hobgoblins, kobolds, and the reptile men are coming next. So that's all about looking at fantasy. Fantasy again. It's much they're much shorter than the dragons books, but again, it's taking this idea of there's a stock idea that's perhaps become rather standardized because of Dungeons and Dragons and its heirs, and how do you reapproach it and handle it in different ways. And I have to say the reptile men are interesting insofar as discovering that this is actually not a mythological thing. There are actually very few reptile men in mythology. It's mostly down to Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard, who gave us reptile men,
Mm.
which saves on the research time, and there's nothing to research. This is always the
Excellent.
danger with GURPS books, doing far too much research. It's a terrible threat.
Any last words before we wrap up?
Well, no, thank you for the interview. I hope people might take another look at dragons, and if you do, feel free to follow the links from that to my other stuff, because I'd like to think that there's other books that books in my back catalogue people might be interested in. I'm sure you can put a link to my webpage if people want to look at my full past history, which is frighteningly long sometimes. But
I'll put a link in the description below.
thanks.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about GURPS Dragons.
No
And
problem. Hope it's interesting.
yes,
And thank you for the interview.
yes, and viewers, thank you for watching. Stay safe out there. Watch out for those skies. You never know what be lurking up there. Take care, everyone.
Bye bye.